Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar. You bet you're live playing the automation tool selection game. Our speaker for the day is Paul Grizzaffi. I'm Smita Mishra, a professional tester, and I'm excited to host you all and Paul on our STP trainings. Before we get started with Paul, I want to take advantage of the fact that we all are here and share quick information with all the testers who have joined us. So we have our conference Fall 2017 STPCon coming up in the Washington, D.C. area from September 25th through 29th this year. So as you can see on the screen, we have various certification courses through these dates. There are workshops through September 26, 27, and conference and sessions through September 28, 29. Typically, the conference topics include automation, agile, performance, DevOps, mobile, security, leadership, strategy, and much more. And we have over 16 workshops and about 40 sessions spanning across various formats like case studies, hands-on exercises, and tool demos. Honestly, something for everybody in testing. So good about that. The exact program will be up there shortly. We have already done shortlisting for our workshops. So however, you can explore the previous conferences and conference pricing and special events for the upcoming one at stpcon.com. And if you register by 26th of August, you get to save up to $400 off your registration. I truly believe that conferring is one of the best ways to learn and also to get to know some reputed testers across the globe all at one place. So I hope you all find it to be the same way. If you are on Twitter, please share the conference information and about this webinar with your followers and connections. We absolutely love the shout outs. And if you hear something during this webinar that you really like, please do tweet about it. And you can use @SoftwareTestPro and tag us for a retweet from us. Another quick piece of information that I have for you is that there is an upcoming webinar, Testing Your Minimum Viable Product, by Tathagat Verma on 26th of May. The link is up for you to review and register. Tathagat is a renowned speaker at STP, also, besides various other conferences that he does, but he's truly an authority on agile practices. And he loves sharing his practical insights, something you all will enjoy. So I hope you go for it. All right, so let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Paul. We are very thrilled to have you with us today. Let me quickly introduce you all, for all of us. So Paul is a principal automation architect at Magenic currently. His career, majorly Paul's career has focused on the creation and deployment of automated test strategies, frameworks, tools, and platforms. He holds a Master of Science in Computer Science and is a certified Scrum Master from Scrum Alliance. Paul has created automation platforms and tool frameworks based on proprietary, open source, and vendor-supplied tool chains in diverse product environments like telecom, stock trading, e-commerce, and healthcare. He's an accomplished speaker who has presented at both local and national meetings and conferences. He's an advisor to software test professionals and STPCon, as well as a member of the Industry Advisory Board of the Advanced Research Center for Software Testing and Quality Assurance, that's STQA, at Dallas. Paul looks forward to sharing his experiences and expanding his automation and testing knowledge of other product environments. All right. So right before we start and before I give the control to Paul, I want to go through with the quick housekeeping points. All the attendees shall remain muted through the webinar. You can type in your questions and share them with us through your question or chat box, whichever appears on your version of GoToWebinar. We shall take them up after Paul is done with his presentation or during it as he prefers. The webinar shall be recorded and posted on the Software Test Pro site for the attendees to go through later. So if you have if you want to look at the slides again, you can do that. You can visit softwaretestpro.com and look through them. All right, Paul. Very warm welcome to you again, and the floor is all yours now. I'm going to hand over the control to you.
All right. Okay, so Today we're going to talk about You Bet Your Life and playing the automation tool selection game. Smita has already done a great job of giving you my background, so I'm not going to waste a whole lot of time on this slide. But here is my contact information. You can send me emails. You can find me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and then I have my blog site over at on WordPress there. So the reason this presentation originally came about, and it's been retooled a few times over the few years since I created it, was I was going through different forums, and all these questions came directly from LinkedIn forums, but all the questions had this sort of theme that ran through them. What's the best automation tool? What's the best tool for iOS? What's the best mobile automation tool to recommend to a client? All of these things. And there was always seemed to be one thing missing from them, and it was how do we go about making this selection? And in part, it's because there are so many options out there. You can see how many tools are popping up here, and that's only a relatively small subset of tools and frameworks and utilities that are out there that you can use for in some form or fashion to do automation for your testing. So what we could do is we could press our luck, and by pressing our luck, we've decided that automation is valuable for my testing. Somewhere along the line, we said, hey, we can take some technology and we can point it at our problem here, and it's going to help us in some way perform our testing activities. So as we do, we check with the experts to see what the best tool is. And as we all know nowadays, the experts are the internet. So we cast our questions out into the internet and we say, hey, internet, what's the best tool? What's the best tool for mobile or browser, or the best test tool, or what's the best open source tool? Because certainly the internet's going to know what I need. So we use a spin. Back in the 70s, there was a game show called Press Your Luck, and you could win certain dollar amounts, but at some point you were allowed to use a spin. And when you spun, you hoped you didn't get a whammy. And a whammy was something that came along and took away all the cash that you had. And frequently when we ask the internet, the experts, we get the whammy. And it comes and it takes all of our cash, and we wind up with a failing or a subpar automation initiative. But hey, doesn't the internet know everything? Isn't the sum of all of our knowledge out on the internet? And the answer quickly is no, it really isn't. Because what it's missing mainly, and when the other experts answer your question, they're only answering that question in the context that you gave them, which is 2 or 3 sentences. Maybe you even spend some time writing a paragraph saying, I need to be able to do this, my boss has asked me to do that, but it's really missing what your context is. It doesn't know what you and your team and your organization and your company really need. Consider hamburgers. I've been on a big hamburger kick lately, but what do you want? Do you want traditional, or are you a person who likes just the bread, the meat, the cheese, and maybe a little mustard or something? Or do you like we have here in the Dallas area, we have a place called Twisted Root Burgers where you can get exotic meats like alligator and kangaroo and elk hamburgers. Or you're on a budget. If you are on a budget, perhaps you should not go for the $16 Wagyu burger at the local steakhouse. And also, where are you? Your location matters. If you tell me the best hamburger restaurant is In-N-Out Burger, perhaps to you, that's true. Perhaps even to me, that would be true. However, if you're telling me that in the small little town that I grew up in Louisiana, that doesn't help me because there are no In-N-Out burgers near my small little town there. So that is not good information for me. It must fit what you're hungry for, and it must fit where you can go and get this particular hamburger. So mapping that back out onto testing and automation, it's got to fit your needs. It's got to fit your needs, not my needs, not company over in Silicon Valley who's kicking some kind of butts needs. It's got to fit your needs and your ecosystem. So I like to look at the automation ecosystem, and I break this automation ecosystem into 3 parts: the strategy, the audience, and the environment. And we'll talk a little about each of these, and then we'll do a compare and contrast of each of these aspects of an automation decision, automation tool decision that I worked with, or that I went through with two different companies that I worked with. So if you remember back in the 70s, there was a game called Hollywood Squares, which was basically celebrity tic-tac-toe. The contestants were just regular people like most of us, and in the squares they had different celebrities there, and the idea was that you would get to tell which celebrity you wanted to answer the question, and if the celebrity got it right, your X or your O got the space. Otherwise, your partners did, or your components, your opponents did. So here we're in a traditional quandary with tic-tac-toe. Either X is going to go straight across the top, or straight across the middle, or straight down the middle, depending on whether or not we're going to get the right answer to the right question. So we want to block X if we're O. So we can either ask Tootie Fields the question, or we can ask Leslie Coggins the question. And frankly, I recognize both of those people's names, but I can't remember who they are back in the 70s reality. But anyway, if we decide it is more strategic for us to ask Tootie Fields the question because she's been getting more right than Leslie has, perhaps we would go with her. So you have to figure out your strategy. And if the experts, the internet, didn't consider your strategy when you asked them what's the best tool, that's your first strike rolling through your automation tool selection. So strategy, you can kind of decompose into two major big questions. What is it that you want to do? What are you trying to accomplish? What are your goals? Are you looking to raise quality or increase coverage? You have some software issues making it out to your users and your customers that you want to catch before they get out there. Or perhaps you're happy with your quality by and large, but what you want to do is you want to get the software out the door faster because that's costing you money, either from an actual standpoint because it's taking too many people too long to do things, or because you're not getting the software into your users' hands fast enough and you're losing out to your competitors. Do you have some high value targets that you need assistance hitting simply because they are too valuable to let go without deep and high coverage testing? And is automation even valuable? A lot of times people don't stop and think about that question. In many cases, automation is absolutely going to be valuable, but if you ask that question and then you process the answer, you might figure out what areas you want to target first and which areas are the most valuable with your automation initiative. And at the bottom line, all of these are business decisions. These are not technical decisions. These are not technology decisions. These are not tool decisions. This is what your business is. You're looking at the strategy of how you're going to engage at the business level, therefore the development level, the testing level, and as a support to testing, automation. So now that you've kind of decided the what, how are you going to go about doing this? What kind of testing are you looking at doing? Are you looking at feature testing? Hey, I've got some new features. I need to test them. I'm going to point some technology at help. Do you want to do lockstep or in-sprint automation with Agile or Scrum or something like that? Are you looking at end-to-end or integration testing? Are you looking for some technological help with your exploratory testing? Are you looking for performance testing? Performance testing, typically the tools will be a different set of tools to perform performance testing than it will be for other types of testing. And are you looking at some or all of the above? Most of us live sort of in that bottom bullet there, but sometimes we are focused on one thing or the other. And are your existing quote test cases automation ready? And automation ready comes in two forms. One are they sufficiently specific that someone can take them and create the steps in some sort of programming language or using some sort of tool to accomplish what it is you'll want to accomplish? In most cases, no, because we rely on humans knowing things, like knowing how to log into a website, being able to tell whether you're logged in or not, understanding whether something's actually made it into the cart or not, if you were doing testing an e-commerce purchase. You have to tell all these things in very, very specific ways to a computer in order for them to perform those. The other part of automation ready is a lot of times mapping what you're doing by hand today, what your testers are actually performing, mapping that directly to automation is not an effective way to go about it. Automation is a different tool. You should use it differently. You should rely upon its strengths and avoid its weaknesses. And one of its strengths is being able to do the same thing over and over and over, often across large permutations of data. So instead of having perhaps one test case for Amex, one test case for Visa, one test case for MasterCard, perhaps you have one script, one little tiny program that iterates across all of those payment types and then performs the checking that way, and you get your results that way. So it's a different mapping from existing what you do today into what you're going to point the technology to do. And are you going to date or are you going to marry your test tool? So if you're dating, you get to pick and choose. Hey, you know what? I like this particular technology for web browser, but I like a different one for mobile and yet another one for web services. You have options and you don't have to go steady. So just like in real life, perhaps the person that you take to the symphony is not the same person you would go with to the Slayer concert. You have options. You can pick and choose. You can merge things together where appropriate, but you won't necessarily have all the benefits of marriage. A lot of times in marriage, you get this large family support. You get families that largely work together. There's some friction here and there, but there's this sense of cohesion along the way. If you marry your tool, monogamy is then in your best interest. So if you're going to choose tool X to do your web browsing and you are going to get right in, you're going to stick with it, you're going to build a tool dependent initiative for automation, there's nothing wrong with that. You get lots of family support that way. You're going to get mobile services, database, thick clients. You probably will even have options to get things like test case management and results repositories, maybe even some nice, cool, slick dashboards and report generation. You're going to get a lot of that family support and many of the things that you want to go in and get married to. But you better like your in-laws. So if you like the web browsing and the mobile aspect of the tool you chose, and you don't really like the web services aspect of it, you're kind of stuck with it. You're going to either have to learn how to work with that weird uncle, or you're going to have to cheat. You have to cheat on the family and bring something else in, which causes its own set of friction, much like it would in real life. So like I said, we'll do some comparisons and contrasts of two engagements that I've been in my not so distant past. At company one, we decided it was valuable to automate. There were some things that technology could help us do. We wanted to increase quality and coverage. We knew there were some new targets along the way. We knew that there was going to be a company acquisition. We didn't know what it was going to be, what the technology was. So we just knew that we had to prepare for change in the not too distant future. We knew we wanted to do feature testing, end-to-end testing. We wanted to apply some high volume automated testing concepts, some non-traditional testing concepts under the automation assist umbrella, and we wanted to do negative testing. Now, negative testing is not something that was in the original version of these slides, but over the last year or a year and a half, I started reading where the marketing material for some tools would call out, hey, we can do negative testing. And I said, oh, why is that such a big deal to call that out as a feature? So I thought I would throw that in here as something people can keep in mind and say, yeah, we want to do some negative testing. Let's make sure that however we want to do that, the tool that we would like to use can do it the way we want for it to do. And there also need to be some test case rehab. The test cases that existed were not ready to be automated, much for the same reasons that I mentioned before about the distinctions around being automation ready. Company 2 looks very similar to Company 1 at the strategy, possibly because the leadership was similar to what I had at Company 1. But we decided it was valuable to automate, increase coverage, new targets on the way. We also have performance testing here. So that was something we had to take into account, not necessarily on a tool-by-tool basis, but knowing that there was going to be some performance testing under the umbrella of automation at this point. And we also needed to do test case rehab for the same reasons. So that kind of wraps up on strategy. So let's go to audience. Also in the 70s, if it's not very clear, I kind of grew up watching a lot of game shows in the 70s. There was a game show called Let's Make a Deal. And part of the shtick of Let's Make a Deal was audience members dressed up in funny outfits and vied for the attention of the host and the producers to try and go and win prizes out from in the audience. So what you wore, where you sat, how you behaved, all of these things were important in you being part of the show. Audience matters. Are you there? The location matters. So did the experts consider your audience when they told you what the best tool was? If they didn't, and they probably didn't because they couldn't, that's a second strike on that particular way of figuring out how to go about choosing a tool. So your audience demographics absolutely matter. Who is in your audience? That's the first and foremost. Who is there? Do you have a bunch of people that know how to program? Or do you have a bunch of experienced testers with little programming coding acumen, but perhaps they can learn, or perhaps they're not interested in learning? Who's in your audience matters, and who is in your new audience matters. As we go, as we evolve our programs, as we evolve our companies, our hiring profile may change. So who's in the audience today, and who do you project will be in the audience going forward? Take these things into account when you choose your tools, because what happens is when you start figuring out who is in and who is out of your audience, the number of potentially appropriate tools for what you're doing changes, and which tools are appropriate changes. So keep that in mind. Audience size may matter as well, particularly around cost. If you are buying a tool, if you're purchasing it from a vendor, typically the more you use, the more licenses you use, the per license cost goes down. But then you're still ponying up that much more money. So you have to do this math, right? Again, back to the business decisions around making this automation decision. You have to factor these things in. Audience size will matter. And again, your automation acumen, not just your programming acumen, but your automation acumen. Do you have people who have done tool selection, tool creation, or framework creation before? Do you have them at your disposal? Is it someone you can rent? Can you bring in a consultant to help you with some of this? Do you have people who have written scripts, who have interacted with the reports? Hey, you know what? I've never written any automation, but at my previous company, the automation would run, and then we would get the reports, and then it was our responsibility to double check the reports or do the debugging or whatever it is. Do you have people who are used to consuming and potentially leading other people on basically making these reports actionable? And do you have buy-in? Are people skeptical? That automation crap never works. Or do you have people that are really excited going, yes, 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 we need help in this area and this area? Do you have any friendlies? If you do, use them to the best of your ability. And also, as I've said a couple of times before, location does matter. Where are you? Where is your audience? It can and should affect your choice. So how many sites do you have? Do you have one building in one city? Do you have multiple buildings in the same city, same country? Are you cross countries? Are you across countries where certain technologies may be embargoed? I worked for a telecom company once where there was a certain encoding algorithm that we were not allowed to ship over to other companies because, I'm sorry, other countries because of some restrictions around embargoed technology. These things matter. If you've got that baked into your automation tool, then that technology cannot leave the country. So be aware of what you can and can't do there. Do you have telecommuters? I work from home exclusively. Magenic is headquartered in Minneapolis. I'm in the Dallas area. So I have some different needs and requirements in order to be able to get into the corporate network to be able to do things. Keep in mind that people will be doing this either full-time like myself, or you're working from home because you're getting your washing machine fixed, or because your kid is sick, or something along those lines. And language matters. Not that kind of language, not the language that we speak, but the language that people understand and know with respect to programming. So what are your developers using? Are your developers actually involved in the creation of the automation? If so, there may be an incentive to use the language that they know. If not, if they are not going to be actively involved, maybe there's not an incentive to do that, and you want something that might be, it might have a little more of a shift than something like, say, a Java, C#, or C++. And how are your relationships? The automation team, especially if there's a segmented team or a segmented discipline under a testing team, tends to wind up in the middle. And that's good, right? So you've got, obviously, the automation team has a relationship with the test team, and also with the dev team, because the automation team can try and influence the dev team to say, hey guys, if you make these types of changes in your product or in our product, or we implement the product this way or design it that way, it is going to cost us less to test and less to automate. Sometimes that's a better business deal, so we need to involve the business. Sometimes the devs want to run off and use the newest bleeding edge technology. We as a company can't lag too far behind, but we also can't chase every butterfly. Chasing butterflies tends to mean some refactor in our testing approach and in our automation, which could be bad business. By involving the business and having a good relationship with the business, we can use them to help us have the discussions with the developers. And the ops team, hey, you know what? I want to spin up 10 of our internal VMs to run some concurrent automation. Have a good relationship with those guys, because they're going to help you out. They're a stakeholder for the automation. As is the security team. Hey, I want to stand up a web server, or I want to stand up a mail server on the corporate network. They're probably not going to like that. But if you explain to them in business terms what you do need, perhaps they can help you do what you need to do, or perhaps they can give you special exemptions because you've gone in, you've partnered with them, you've brought the business together with them. And then the release management team, hey, I want to run this automation every time a build gets plopped out on the development environment or the QA environment. Have the relationships with these guys, and you will ultimately have stronger relationships, because all of these teams are indirectly related as well. You can be the broker for these. It puts you in a really good position to be able to get things done. Why am I telling you this? Well, I kind of cut to the chase already, but the relationships affect behavior. If your relationships are good, you're going to be able to have trust and dialogue. They will help you with things. It allows culture change. It allows focusing on the business, and it allows the middle to facilitate these changes. Why do we care about this? The better the relationships are, the more latitude you will get from these stakeholder departments. It increases the number of viable tools you can use. You won't have as many restrictions on what you're allowed to do, so you have more choices in tooling. So going back to our comparing and contrast, company one assessed and participated in the hiring. The management at the time, what they were doing was they were saying, okay, as contractor contracts expire, we're not going to renew some of them. We're going to bring in different contractors or bring in full-time people that have some testing and some coding expertise. So we looked at the staff that we had as well as the staff that we wanted to bring in. Training. We also trained the internal people to be able to participate in the automation initiative. So again, the staff you have today and the staff that you potentially have coming in. With very limited outsourcing. In fact, when I got there was almost none with the team I was working with. The test team was very receptive. They understood the power that could be brought with automation, but they had very little experience in actually creating the automation. The dev team was trailing on that receptiveness and all, but they were very interested, and they wound up not actually typing keys to create automation, but they were definitely interested in making the product more automatable for us. Fortunately, we had ready and willing leadership to invest, so that helped. It also gave us a longer lead time before we started having to show value, because they also knew what the value was going to be. And I had friendlies. I had people that I could go and sit with and say, hey, what are we going to do here? So I talked to the test prime, and she and I would sit and we'd execute this automation, and she'd point out, nope, that's not right, and why is that doing that? And I'd go back to my desk and I'd brew up some other things and work through this prototyping, iterative type of an approach with her. Compare and contrast that with two, again, came in, assessed and participated in the hiring. Very large percentage of the company was outsourced, not just large percentage of the testing team, but also of the development team. Test team was receptive, low automation experience, and it was team to team as to what the devs were doing. The devs were trailing in some places, and toward the end they were very highly engaged, and we even had a small pocket of developers that were actually pushing us, going faster, we want to automate this and we want to get into this place. So it was a good problem to have, but still sort of managing the expectations across became a little bit challenging. Again, leadership was ready and willing, had friendlies, but it was very hard to involve the business. And not from a standpoint of they didn't want to be involved, but the business, particularly the product owners and product management, they were spread so thin over what they were doing, they just didn't have time to be as engaged as I really wanted them to be with this particular aspect of the business. So that kind of wraps up what we're talking about on audience. So now we go to environment. So I kind of stretched for a game show analogy for environment, but here what you see is Kitchen Stadium from the Japanese version of Iron Chef. And if you're not familiar with Iron Chef, it's the idea that two high-end chefs will come and compete in each other and effectively a cooking contest. There's a secret ingredient. They can bring in their own, some supplementary ingredients, pots and pans, certain things they can bring in, but other things like the ovens and the stoves and all, they're part of the environment. They're part of what is there, and you're doing it live. There are people watching. There are celebrity judges. All of these things change the environment and how these guys do their work. So they have to be very sensitive to the environment. So being sensitive to the environment, if the experts, the internet, were not sensitive to your environment when they said, hey, here's what the best tool is, that's strike three. And if you get third strike on Family Feud, then it goes over to the other team, and it's just kind of a bad sign there. So as far as the environment, this is the one most of us start with, and most of us get right. What are you testing? What is your product? What kind of state is it in? Is it new? Are you lucky enough that we're working on a greenfield kind of setup where we're creating the product and choosing the tools and creating the automation all at the same time? Most of us aren't that lucky. Most of us live in these bottom two bullets, which is something existing and relatively mature, but we're adding new features and fixes to it. So how do we choose an automation tool for that? This one is a little more tricky. We have the legacy product, and we're migrating to a new tech, a new architecture, or a new platform, or something there. Many of us these days live here. So you decide, do you need a tool that can automate against your legacy platform and your new platform? Are you going to have two separate tools? Or are you going to ignore legacy? We're going to be done with legacy in 6 months anyway, which turns into 16 months. So we're not going to bother dealing with automating that. Maybe that's the right decision. Maybe it's not. Again, it depends on how much effort are you expending on your legacy product, how and how long is that legacy product going to be around? But your product status absolutely matters when it comes to choosing an automation technology. And then what type of product do you have? Is it a desktop thick client? Is it a mobile? Is it web? Is it a combination of these things? And is it a distributed system? Is it all over the place like a website would be, or is it more like an app like, say, Microsoft Word would be? And are we dealing with embedded technologies and embedded software where we're dealing with proprietary operating systems sometimes and proprietary hardware where we're going to take this thing, we're going to test it, and then it's going to go into a jet fighter, or it's going to go into a pacemaker, or it's going to go into an automobile? Those types of things absolutely matter, because that third bullet there for embedded, you're not going to find a whole lot of off-the-shelf test tools for things like that. So you're going to have to get a lot more creative in that space. And how automatable is your product? In general, are there hooks into the product? Is there a messaging interface? Or, hey, you're in telecom where it is a messaging protocol that you're testing, what's very automatable typically, because the message flows are spec'd out. The thing you're testing expects certain messages in certain formats and certain time frames. As long as you can maintain the timing of that, it's typically not that. I don't want to minimize it, because it is kind of a pain to do these things. But from an automatability standpoint, I would say it's highly automatable. APIs, what we call APIs today, the sort of the services type of APIs, definitely automatable. And even the traditional, what I used to call APIs, is, hey, I have a library, or I have a piece of hardware I'm controlling, and I have this API that I compile and link into my program and test against it. Those things are very automatable as well. But when it comes into GUIs and things, different types of graphical visual UIs, those things are much harder to automate. And it starts mattering what operating system are you on, which operating systems and browser versions and all sorts of things are you on there. The more things you have to worry about that you want one tool to do, typically the number of tools that you're going to have to choose from is going to shrink a bit. And then what technology are you using? Are you using ASP? Are you using .NET? Are you using Angular? Are you a Java-based or a Java stack technology? These things may or may not configure into what it is you want to do, because again, it's particular to you and your company and your testing approach. You need to pick a technology, a tool that's going to match what it is that you want to do. And what's your test bed? What are you testing on? Are you testing on your desktop? Are you running your automation on your desktop? Is it a laptop? I've actually created a lab of just laptops, because they were going to go out to the recycler and I needed some raw horsepower, and we just sort of farmed out our automation tests to run off our desktops there. Are you on a segregated LAN segment where it's not easy to get to all of the network resources that you may want or that your tool may require you to have? Which OS combination are we going to be testing on? If you are strictly a Windows platform, cool, you have a broad set of tools. If you are cross-platform, your set of tools probably is going to shrink down, because not every tool works on every operating system, and not every tool works on every operating system equally. So you have to take those things in consideration as well. Are you going to work in virtual environments? Some tools specify, I work in virtual environment A and B, and either they don't mention C, D, and E, or they'll call out those and say those aren't supported. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but if you have a problem, don't come call us. Do you have devices or specialty or proprietary hardware, like you're in the medical device industry, or again, you're working with embedded types of hardware and software that are going to go into some other thing like an appliance or a vehicle or some sort of a weapon or something? And with what do you interact? Your whole testing approach, what things do you interact outside? With what things do you interact outside of your product? Do you have a repository for your test scripts or your test charters or your test cases? Do we need to be able to extract things out of there automatically with the test tool? If so, you need to have something that is going to pick a tool that does that, or a tool that has some ability to have an intermediate interface so that you can pull it out, transform it into what the tool wants, and then bring it into the tool. And sort of the same thing on the other side for the results repository. If the tool needs to automatically import into the results repository, it needs to generate results in the format that the repository wants. Continuous integration environments. It's not as big a deal anymore because most tools have a command line driver interface that you can put in there. But sometimes it matters. Sometimes, hey, you know what? In order to run these types of browser-based tools, I need a test agent that has a real or a virtual display. Otherwise, I can't take screenshots or I can't find and click things in the browser. If you're going to work with a continuous integration environment, look at how your tests and your test scripts will be spawned out of there and what sort of requirements you're going to need on the agent machine. And then the cloud, right? Yay, cloud. Is the product in the cloud? Is the test environment in the cloud? Is your automation in the cloud? Is your automation supported on your cloud provider, sort of like the virtual environment? Is your cloud environment something that your tool vendor or your tool of choice vendor is going to support you on? And what about a license server? I worked with a tool that was license served, and we had the license server in-house. So we always had to be able to connect to the license server in order to spawn the tool. Got a little bit of a rude awakening when I was at an airport and I was going to try and do a little bit of work on that tool, and it couldn't get a license because I wasn't connected to the VPN. Like, oops. So I got to connect to the VPN to get to it. If the license server is in a place where you can't get to it, like, hey, we have to run on a segregated LAN that is off our desktop because of our security processes or procedures or policies, well, then the license server also has to be on that segregated LAN. But then you can't run any scripts or anything else anywhere else. And if the license server then has to communicate back to the company, the vendor company, then you have this weird, wait a minute, I can't get my license information back out. So perhaps a license served approach here for this type of environment isn't the right thing. Does your vendor of choice offer a node lock license or an ID lock license? And if so, does the pricing significantly change in your favor or out of your favor? So similarly, we all have a box to live in. Some of us get to live in a big box, some of us not so much. So networking and security matters. There will be restrictions on what you can and can't do on your corporate network, what you can or can't do on your testing network. Intellectual property. Some companies consider their test cases and test scripts and sort of tool flows as intellectual property because it describes in great detail how their products work. Some of those companies are sort of leery of letting you put that type of information in the cloud or letting it go anywhere off of premises. Keep that in mind. Are there compliance concerns? Hey, we've got this test data we're using, but it's based on real data that we de-identified. Does that run afoul of HIPAA or PCI? You should check that out with your legal and your compliance department. And as we all know, it always comes down to budget. Are we going to buy something? Do we have cash to put out up front? Are we going to build something? We're going to pay for it a little as we go. Are we going to steal something? I mean, are we going to get something from open source? There are very valuable approaches to open source, but remember, open source is free from a licensing standpoint. It's not actually free. You're still going to spend some money, transitively at least, by saying I have to have some people come in and fool with this and keep it up and potentially extend it. Doing the compare and contrast on the environment aspect. So company one, we had web, we had services, we had a thick client, but I went in, it was greenfield. We had no automation, but we had a product. So there were needs, there were things that they wanted to automate, and we spent a lot of time talking about what to automate and also what not to automate. Just as important, if not more important, what are we not going to do and for what reason? Very small user base, very small number of products, depending on how you counted them, there were like 3 or 4. Multi-browser, multi-OS, also mobile. And for a continuous integration environment, we didn't really have that when I got started. Eventually, we started using Jenkins, and then to execute and store the results, we're using the Microsoft Test Management. Contrast that with Company 2, web services, thick client, looks very similar. But here, we already had an existing automation infrastructure, but it had needs. As an example, what the VP that brought me in to help with the evolution said was, these guys were told to drive to Houston, and they did it. They got in the car and they drove to Houston. We don't need to go to Houston anymore. Now we need to go to Hawaii. So different vehicle, different mechanism of travel. We're going to have to retool what we're doing so that we can get to the destination we need to go. We have new quality goals now. So we talked a lot about what we would and would not automate. We had a much larger and a mixed user base. When I say mixed, I mean people that were here, people that were in other US cities, people that were in India, and mixed from an automation and programming acumen standpoint. People who had done it, people who had not done it and had no interest in it, people who had computer science degrees, people who had geology degrees, just really all over the place. And we had a very large number of products there. This was an enterprise testing and automation team. So depending on how you counted, we had about 25 different products. Strictly Windows, i.e. in .NET with no mobile, and our continuous integration environment was Team City. So if you're familiar with the Gong Show, or if you're not familiar with the Gong Show, it's very much like the 70s version of America's Got Talent, where there are 3 celebrities and they would vote on if there was an act going on. Yes, we like the act. No, we don't. If they didn't like the act, they would get up and they would hit this gong. So I'm going to prematurely gong myself here and say, dude, really? All of this research and questioning and soul searching just to pick an automation tool? So no, you don't really have to do all of these things, but all of these things, any of these things may be important to you, and maybe one is more important to you than it is to the person sitting next to you. What I'm really driving here is that you need to understand your context, and you need to take your particular context into consideration when you're choosing this automation. You to demo and say, wow, that looks good. You can't talk to your friend who's over at other successful company to say, what are you using? Oh, great, we're going to use that too. It's okay to learn about the tools. It's okay to go from the other end to say, you know what, we're going to do some of this research on our ecosystem, but we don't know a lot about what's out there in the market. We're going to play around with some of these tools. My main message here is don't prematurely decide. Don't listen to your buddy, or don't make your assumption based on or your decision based on your buddy or what you read in CIO magazine or what you saw from a vendor at some conference. And we've also looked at automation tool being sort of the secondary decision. You've got all these other pieces in place because most of us do. But if you're in a green field, or if you're actually doing a complete retooling, you can potentially use the automation as what we call the boss card, the thing that's the highest card left in the deck or left in the hand. So it's the one that's going to drive all the other decisions. We've decided we're going to use tool X for our automation. Therefore, our choices of test case repository are A, B, and C, and our choices for results repository are L, M, and N. So really all we're talking about here is narrowing the options. You've got this big sea of tools and frameworks to choose from. And each of these, the strategy, the audience, and the environment are all about filtering down into a digestible and manageable set of appropriate candidates. So Jeopardy is something I used to watch a lot when I was in high school and college. And Final Jeopardy is where at the end you can wager some or all of your money to try and really outdo the other 2 components. And if you're not familiar with Jeopardy, Jeopardy is sort of the backwards game show where they don't ask a question, they give you an answer, and you have to come up with the question. So today's Final Jeopardy answer is best in class. The question for this is, what is an overused software term? because we hear a lot about best. What drove this entire presentation was my continual seeing of the word best. And we talk about best in class and best this and best that. I don't like best because it sends the wrong message. I prefer most appropriate in class because I like to talk about being appropriate. Now, some would argue, and I agree with them, that, well, when we say best in class, best practices, well, what we mean is you're generally supposed to do that. And maybe I know that. And maybe the person I'm talking to knows that. But it is very clear that on average, not everybody knows that, because best practices and best in class start getting hammered on us as, well, this is what they said to do. This is the best way to do it. We're going to do it. Instead of sort of taking that as a group of suggestions that say, in general, this works pretty well, but you may have to morph it for you. Because remember, best isn't always what's needed, and best isn't always what's best for you. It's relative. Remember that hamburger discussion. So my suggestion is always start with what's appropriate and evolve when no longer appropriate. So what did we wind up with at Company One? At Company One, we had that unclear technology roadmap. We needed web testing via the browser first. We looked at several tools at the time. The vendor supplied tools weren't cost effective just because of team size and demographic. We looked at Selenium RC and IDE. They weren't appropriate. They didn't fit what our strategy was. And Selenium WebDriver was coming into its own, but there were some things missing and some things that were a little unstable about it that we weren't quite prepared to take a dive on that yet. So what we did was we created a layered framework with Ruby, and we had abstracted away the tool specifics so that later on, when we knew that WebDriver was going to be ready, so when it was ready for us, we swapped the tools out from underneath. No impact to the business logic. All the changes in effort were in the lower layers, so we could keep that sort of contract, that automated contract between what we thought the requirements were and how the software was supposed to behave. And eventually we needed web services and other ancillary capabilities like databases and CSV files. So what we did was we extended our framework as we got there. For Company Two, again, we had the unclear roadmap, but it was across many, many products with many different interfaces. We needed web, non-web UI, and non-traditional automation. We had some products that were older and not created to be testable, and certainly not created to be automated. So we had to get a little creative in how we applied technology to help us do our job. We had an existing initiative using Test Complete, and we needed to do some evolution there. We were already married to Test Complete by the time I got there. So we created a tool-dependent layered framework with scripting, because layering, even in a tool-dependent framework, can help you with abstraction and further maintenance down the road. And we supplemented some corner cases with open source and some other sorts of automation assist. Now, on Wheel of Fortune, sometimes you would land on the free spin token, and if you actually got the letter, guessed the correct letter, and there was at least one of them there, you would get a free spin. You would get to spin again. Well, for our development organization, they got a free spin. We got some newer Scrum training. Some people magically discovered something called automation and thought it was the greatest thing in the world. So we decided we were going to start doing automation, and then we were going to use a test-first approach. Specifically, they wanted to talk about doing BDD. We had new participants now. In addition to the testers, the developers wanted in. They're like, yes, we see the value and we're going to help. They already knew C#. C# was the language of the company, and the product owners were also allegedly engaged. Didn't really work out that way in the long run, but it did look good on paper. Selenium had attractive licensing. We weren't going to be restricted to where we could run it and how many licenses we could have, like some of the other tools that we had. And there was a lot of excitement and momentum around Selenium because of this training that the teams got. So it was the decision of, do I fight the momentum and say we're going to stick with test complete and we're going to try and do BDD with that, or do we morph over to Selenium and ride the momentum wave? What we did was, with Selenium, we created a layered framework with scripting for tool independence. We put SpecFlow on top of it for the non-technical and for the BDD audience. But we kept test complete where it mattered and where it was working. For some of the products, test complete was a better approach for technological and business reasons. Other products, not so much. So in general, what do I suggest? I suggest you take a broad assessment of your ecosystem and play with stuff. Go from both sides. Play with some open source or free trial tools, particularly if you're either out of touch with the current automation landscape, or if you've never really had any time with that. You need to understand what these tools can and can't do in order for you to make. Sometimes playing with tools will give you other questions to ask about your ecosystem. And prototype, absolutely prototype, but prototype with the appropriate tools and assess, but do the prototype on something that you're actually going to automate for real. It's great to automate against fake website A or Amazon or Google, whatever. I'm not saying don't do that, but don't make your decision based on that. Go and prototype against your product and prototype against something tricky in your product. Hey, we have this screwy grid display control thing here. Let's make sure we can interact with that. Then after that, you assess what you're doing. Do you need a prototype with a different tool? Do you need to start evolving and abstracting away tool specifics? Do you need to develop a small smoke or sanity suite and then reassess again? Do you need a deeper assessment of your ecosystem? Hey, this looks good, but we know we haven't done our deep dive yet. So the original version of the presentation did not have this next slide, but watching people talk and different answers to questions over the last couple of years, I added a slide, and Keith Klain tried to steal my thunder today, as did Jim Hazen in a different forum. But ultimately, this is the most appropriate tool for your testing and for your automation. Obviously, we can't automate our brain, but all of this is about using our brain to make our decisions with all of the pieces that we have at our disposal. So some quick takeaways, because I know we're about out of time here. Focus on your ecosystem: strategy, automation, audience, environment. Don't decide prematurely. Go ahead and play with things, but don't ignore the strategy, audience, and environment. And remember, most appropriate in class, be appropriate, do appropriate things until it's time to not be appropriate anymore. Let's see, what time is it? Do we have time for a couple of questions or no?
Yes, Paul. Probably I'll just take a couple of them.
Okay.
We've just received a question that says, "Hi, Paul. Do you know any application with which we can automate Citrix-based application?"
You know, not off the top of my head. That's one of the things you learn when you spend a lot of time in automation is you ask the question like that, but not everybody's going to have the answer, or not every one of the people has worked in all of these environments. So Google is your friend, and I would start with Google. I would even go potentially to Citrix and say, what are people using? You know, what are 2 or 3 of the tools that you hear most about that people are using to interact with your system with?
All right. Jim Hazen did make a comment right after saying Citrix requires the tool to be in the session with the application. It's a blob. So, okay, I'll move on to the next question for now. It comes from Kamlesh. He says, "Have you had to start with a tool or technology and then had to change it? If yes, why?"
Yes. So that was the story toward the end there with the free spin. We changed because, again, of 2 reasons. One was the teams got the religion, right? They got the, hey, we need to go and do automation. We're going to be a holistic approach. Everybody's going to participate in some level. So going with the level of expertise, going with the language that was predominantly provided, or that was predominantly used in the organization, it precluded us from going down that road with Test Complete. So we made a pivot for some of the products on Test Complete. But Test Complete was doing a really good job with other products. There was no business case for us to go and disturb what was going on there. So we used Test Complete, and I think they are probably still using Test Complete there. And very similar at the previous job to that as well, where we knew what we were picking was a short-term fix because the thing we really wanted to use just wasn't quite ready yet, and we were going to move to it when it was ready. So typically what happens is there's a business shift or there's a technology shift, but the technology shift has to be rooted in business. If you're not making these switches with a business brain on, then you're probably not making the right decision.
All right, so we're running out of time, Paul, but I'll ask this one last one. It
Okay.
comes from Shawl. So Shawl, you have also asked, can we get a copy of the slides? So yes, it will be posted as a recording. The webinar is recorded and it will be posted on softwaretestpro.com. So here is the question, Paul. He's saying, how valuable are developers for test automation, apart from the test engineers?
Yes. So yes, developers are valuable, right? The whole team is valuable, but especially when you look at, if you look at everything as being a team initiative, as, hey, getting software out the door is a team initiative, all right? It's a company initiative, it's an organization initiative, it's a team initiative. Therefore, everybody should have an interest in getting the software out the door. If a developer can come in and code something faster than a non-developer can, or even if person A can code and person B can, or better, or more appropriately, it doesn't matter what they're sort of designated. Are they useful? Absolutely. Everything from actually typing keys on creating automation to making the product more automatable and testable, to being a coach or a mentor or a teacher on how to program.
All right. So Paul, thanks for your time today. It was a
Absolutely.
very engaging session with loads of practical tips and information on all the, I would say, major components of automation. And in your language, it was the most appropriate in class.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm sure our attendees found it very informative and useful too. So thanks again.
Absolutely. Absolutely.